Welcome to Creepy Corner Stories, where shadows come alive and nightmares take shape. Grab your popcorn and blanket and prepare to be chilled to the bone. Eleanor had always been drawn to antiques. The older, the better. She loved the stories they carried, even if the tales were sometimes unsettling. So, when she found the porcelain doll at the estate sale of the late Mrs. Cartwright, she couldn't resist. It was exquisite, with glassy eyes that seemed to follow her, and a delicate smile that didn't match the dim light of the room. "It's an heirloom," the elderly auctioneer had said, eyes shadowed with something she couldn't name. "But it's said to be cursed." The Cartwrights were known for strange events, unexplained disappearances. I'd think twice before taking her home. Eleanor's curiosity won. She wrapped the doll in soft cloth and carried it home, unaware that she had just welcomed the beginning of her nightmare. The first sign. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping from the living room. At first, she told herself it was the wind or the house settling, but the sound grew louder. She crept out of bed, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. The living room was empty, except for the doll sitting on the antique rocking chair she had placed it on. But its head had turned to face her, and its smile had widened. "Go away," she whispered, her voice trembling. The room felt colder, the air thick with a presence she could not see. The whispers. Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder, coming from corners where no one stood and from the creaks of the floorboards at night. Eleanor could no longer deny the reality that something was in her home with her. The doll seemed to be everywhere, on the dining table when she turned away, in the hallway, just out of sight. One evening, unable to take it anymore, Eleanor moved the doll to the attic and locked the door. That night, as she sat trembling in her bed, she heard a faint voice, tiny and fragile. "I can't stay here." Eleanor's heart stopped. The voice was that of a young girl, sweet and innocent but filled with terror. Its old journal. The next morning, she decided to face what was happening. In the attic, she found an old journal belonging to Mrs. Cartwright. The pages were stained with dark ink and covered with scribbles that seemed to twist and writhe. "She's awake," one entry read. "She's calling for me. The house is not safe anymore." The last line, scrawled hurriedly, sent a shiver down her spine. "The doll will never be alone." The return. Suddenly, the attic door creaked open, and the doll's porcelain face peered out from the darkness. The whispers grew louder, now a chorus of childlike voices crying, begging for freedom. Eleanor ran, stumbling over boxes and tripping down the stairs, but the doll was always there, moving faster than any creature should. She made it to the front door, fumbling with the lock as the whispers turned into a high-pitched scream. The doll's voice, desperate and shattered, echoed through the house. "Stay with me!" Eleanor bolted out into the night, not daring to look back. But even as she ran into the cold, dark street, she heard the soft, final whisper of the doll behind her, fading into the wind. "I'm coming, Eleanor." The haunted child's play. It began the night we moved into the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house was charming, with its creaky floorboards and vintage charm. But something about it felt off. My husband said I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Our 5-year-old son, Danny, adjusted well at first. He was thrilled about having such a big backyard to explore and a new bedroom to call his own. But within a week, he started waking up in the middle of the night, his tiny feet padding to our room as he mumbled about his friend. "What friend, sweetheart?" I asked, brushing his hair back one night. "Charlie," he said matter-of-factly. "He plays with me when it's dark." The first encounter. I tried to shrug it off as an imaginary friend. After all, we had just moved, and Danny was probably lonely. But the nights grew stranger. I would hear the sound of laughter from his room, even when he was supposed to be asleep. Toys moved from one spot to another without explanation. One evening, I decided to ask him more about Charlie. "What does Charlie look like?" Danny paused, his little face scrunched in thought. "He's small, like me. He wears old clothes and doesn't like when it's daytime." A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just his imagination, but deep down, I felt something sinister was at play. Strange marks things escalated when I began noticing marks around the house. Small handprints on the walls, smudged in what looked like ash. Danny insisted they were Charlie's. The worst came when I found scratches on Danny's arms one morning. "Did you hurt yourself?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He shook his head. "Charlie did it. He got mad because I said I wanted to play with Mommy." That night, I stayed awake in Danny's room, determined to catch whatever was causing this. At around 2 a.m., the room grew icy cold. The rocking chair in the corner began to sway back and forth, though there was no breeze. I heard giggles, soft, chilling, and definitely not my son's. The history of the house. The next day, I dug into the history of the house. What I discovered sent shivers down my spine. Decades ago, a boy named Charlie had lived there. He had died tragically in a fire that consumed the barn out back. Rumor had it, Charlie's spirit never left, seeking playmates to replace the life he had lost. The confrontation. Desperate, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator. When he arrived, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. "There's definitely a presence here," he said, lighting sage and murmuring prayers. That night, as we tried to cleanse the house, Danny's laughter echoed from his room. We rushed upstairs to find him sitting in the middle of the floor, talking to thin air. "Charlie says he doesn't want to leave," Danny said, his voice distant, almost monotone. The investigator began chanting louder, and that's when the room erupted in chaos. Toys flew off shelves, the rocking chair tipped over, and a guttural scream filled the air. Then, silence. The aftermath. After that night, the house felt lighter, the oppressive presence gone. Danny stopped mentioning Charlie, and the strange occurrences ceased. But every now and then, I catch him looking out the window at the barn, a sad expression on his face. "Do you miss Charlie?" I asked once. Danny nodded. "He wasn't always mean. He just wanted to play." The barn remains untouched, a haunting reminder of the boy who lost his life too soon. And though Charlie is gone, I sometimes wonder if he's still watching, waiting for another friend to join his endless game of hide and seek. The Forgotten Room. It was an old Victorian mansion that my family inherited after my great-aunt Lillian passed away. The house stood at the edge of a dense forest, its high spires piercing the foggy sky. Though beautiful, there was something unnerving about the place. The realtor had mentioned one oddity. There was a locked room on the third floor. Lillian had explicitly instructed in her will that no one was to enter that room. My parents shrugged it off, eager to move in and fix the house. I, however, couldn't stop thinking about it. From the moment we moved in, strange things began to happen. At night, I heard soft, scratching noises from above my bedroom. My parents dismissed it as squirrels in the attic, but I wasn't convinced. One evening, as I lay awake, the scratches became louder, more deliberate. They seemed to move across the ceiling, heading toward the hall. I got up and followed the sound. It stopped at the door of the forbidden room. The door's surface was scratched, as though someone or something had clawed at it, desperate to get in or out. I couldn't let it go. One afternoon, while cleaning the library, I stumbled upon an old, rusted key inside a dusty book labeled Lillian's Secrets. My heart raced as I held it. Could this be the key to the locked room? That night, while my parents slept, I crept upstairs. The key fit perfectly. With trembling hands, I turned it. The door creaked open to reveal a cold, dimly lit space. It smelled of mildew and something metallic, like old blood. The walls were lined with strange symbols drawn in red. In the center of the room was a single chair chained to the floor. There were scratch marks on the walls and the chair, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. A soft whisper filled the room. "Why did you come here?" I froze. The voice was raspy and low, echoing as though it came from the walls themselves. I didn't mean to disturb anything," I stammered. "Too late," it hissed. Suddenly, the symbols on the walls began to glow, casting the room in an eerie red light. Shadows stretched and twisted, forming the outline of a figure. It looked like a woman, her face obscured, but her eyes glowing bright white. "You've broken the seal," she said, her voice rising. "They'll come for you now." "Who?" I asked, backing toward the door. She didn't answer. Instead, she lunged forward and the room went pitch black. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat. At first, I thought it was a dream, but when I looked down, my hands were covered in dust and my shoes had dirt on them. Since that night, the house hasn't been the same. Doors slam on their own, lights flicker, and the sound of footsteps echoes in empty halls. My parents think it's electrical issues or the old structure settling, but I know better. The whispers follow me everywhere, growing louder each night. And the scratching? It's no longer just at the ceiling, it's at my bedroom door.
When Jennifer and her family moved into their dream house, they couldn't believe the deal they got. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion with ornate woodwork and a massive yard. "It's a little old," the realtor admitted, "but full of charm." Jennifer brushed off the creaks and groans of the place as harmless quirks. That changed the night they unpacked. Jennifer was in the kitchen when she noticed a faint giggle, like that of a child, coming from the empty dining room. She paused, calling out, "Sarah?" assuming her daughter had wandered in. No answer. Peeking into the room, she found it empty, except for the boxes they hadn't unpacked yet. Just as she turned to leave, the giggle came again, this time closer. It sent a chill down her spine. That night, Sarah woke up screaming. "The boy under my bed keeps staring at me," she cried. Jennifer checked but found nothing. Yet, as she tucked her daughter back in, she noticed small childlike handprints smeared across the bedroom window. From the inside, over the next week, the disturbances grew. Doors slammed shut on their own. Lights flickered even after changing the bulbs, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the halls at night. One evening, Jennifer ventured into the attic to look for a missing box. In the far corner, she found an old dust-covered family portrait. It showed a stern-looking man, a pale woman clutching a baby, and two unsmiling children. A sudden chill swept through the attic. Jennifer turned to leave but froze when she heard a voice whisper, "Why did you move in?" She stumbled down the stairs, the picture clutched tightly in her hands. But when she showed it to her husband, he frowned. "There's no one in this photo, Jen. It's just an empty frame." That night, the family was awoken by deafening noises. A cacophony of laughter, wailing, and thudding footsteps. Jennifer ran to Sarah's room only to find her standing stiffly in the corner, pointing at the bed. "They're all here," Sarah whispered. Jennifer turned and saw them. The family from the portrait. They stood around the room, their eyes hollow and accusing. The boy crouched under the bed, his grin unnaturally wide. The baby, held by the pale mother, let out a shrill, inhuman scream. The man stepped forward, his voice like gravel. "You've disturbed our home." Jennifer tried to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, Jennifer and her husband decided they couldn't stay another night. As they packed to leave, the house seemed to come alive. Shadows stretched across the walls, faces appeared in the mirrors, and whispers followed them from room to room. When they reached the front door, it wouldn't budge. They tugged, slammed, and even tried breaking a window, but the glass refused to shatter. The house wouldn't let them leave. Desperate, Jennifer returned to the attic, hoping for some clue. There, she found a journal left by the previous owner. It detailed the tragic history of the ghostly family. They had been poisoned by the father, who believed their home was cursed. "They will never leave," the last entry read, "and neither will we." As she read the final line, Jennifer felt icy hands on her shoulders. A voice whispered into her ear, "You're one of us now." The journal fell from her hands as the attic door slammed shut. Her screams echoed through the house, blending with the laughter of the ghostly family. They say the house still stands, and if you listen closely, you can hear Jennifer's family begging to be freed, trapped in an endless cycle of terror. With their new family detective, Laura Crow had heard rumors about Precinct 13 for years. A derelict police station on the edge of town, it was said to be cursed, a place where officers vanished and cases went unsolved. It had been closed for over 2 decades after a grisly massacre no one could explain. When she was assigned to catalog old case files from the precinct, she brushed off the superstitions. It was just an old building, she told herself, nothing more. But the moment she stepped through its heavy iron doors, Laura felt the air grow heavier, colder, as if the building itself were alive. Inside, the station was frozen in time. Desks sat cluttered with yellowed papers, a forgotten cup of coffee still on one desk, its surface now a dry brown stain. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows. Laura's task seemed simple: retrieve case files from the basement archives. But as she moved through the halls, strange things began to happen. The first was the sound, a faint scratching, like nails on wood, coming from an interrogation room. When she peeked inside, the room was empty. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder, more frantic. Then came the voices. "Why didn't you help me?" Laura spun around, flashlight shaking. The hall behind her was empty, but the voice was unmistakable. Hoarse, desperate, and close. Determined to finish quickly, Laura descended to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint, metallic smell hit her like blood. The archives were a chaotic mess, files strewn everywhere, as though someone had ransacked the room in a hurry. She found a file labeled "The Final Incident" and opened it. Inside were crime scene photos and reports detailing a night of horror. According to the file, the officers on duty one stormy night had begun turning on each other, accusing one another of corruption, betrayal, and worse. The last report, scrawled in shaky handwriting, read, "It's in the walls. It sees us. It feeds on our guilt." As Laura read, the lights in the basement flickered and went out. In the oppressive darkness, Laura's flashlight barely pierced the void. Shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping closer with each flick of the beam. A low, guttural growl came from the far corner of the room. Laura's breath quickened as she turned the light toward the sound. There, she saw them. Figures cloaked in shadows, their faces pale and distorted, their eyes glowing with hatred. One stepped forward, a former officer, judging by his tattered uniform. His voice was a raspy whisper. "We paid the price. Now you will too." Laura stumbled back, clutching the file as the figures closed in. She managed to escape the basement, slamming the door shut behind her, but the shadows weren't done. As she moved through the station, the walls began to bleed a thick black substance. The voices returned, louder this time, screaming accusations and pleading for help. Laura tried the front doors, but they wouldn't budge. The windows were unbreakable. She was trapped. Desperate, she flipped through the file again. A single note scribbled in the margins caught her eye. "Confess, and it may let you go." But confess to what? The spirits surrounded her now, their faces twisted with anger and despair. Laura, shaking, shouted, "I don't know what you want." One ghost stepped forward, a woman in blood-stained civilian clothes. "You let me die," she hissed. Images flooded Laura's mind. A woman's frantic 911 call, ignored because Laura had been too tired to handle another case that night. The woman had been found dead the next morning. Tears streaming down her face, Laura whispered, "I'm sorry. I should have helped you." The ghost paused. The black substance receded, and for a moment, Laura thought she might be free. But then the officer ghost appeared again, smiling wickedly. "You think it's that easy?" The walls closed in. The voices rose to a deafening roar, and the world around Laura dissolved into darkness. When she opened her eyes, she was sitting at a desk in Precinct 13. Her name now etched into the brass plaque on the desk. The shadows watched her from the corners, whispering, waiting. The curse had claimed another soul. Now, Laura was part of the station, a new prisoner, doomed to serve in the cursed precinct forever.